they're pills. There's all sorts of ways you can get nutritional supplements. So we're going to talk about some of the main nutrients used in supplements for bones, but some of your questions are probably going to be for the ones that aren't the main players. We'll see at the end or in the chat if you have some on those. I'm going to talk about some new trends relating diet and bone, the value of the food matrix that is not captured at all in the pill forms of supplements, some bioactive foods and ingredients that are being researched and some strong evidence for, and then something about public health guidance at the end. So to start with, there's much confusion in the literature about nutrition and bone, and there are a number of reasons for that. And I've recently written a review in Nutrition Today that goes through all of the supplements, what the evidence is. So that may be useful to you if you really want to look up the science behind them. But some of the reasons are when you introduce a research study and you're assigned to a pill, it could be the supplement being tested or it could be the placebo control. But if there's poor compliance, you really aren't testing whether or not that supplement is effective. And these studies are notoriously bad about participant compliance. Also, the baseline status in these randomized controlled trials really dictates whether they're going to be effective or not. I'm going to talk about that in the next couple of slides. The methods for assessing what you usually consume are very weak. People can't remember what they ate, or determine how much they ate or how often they ate it. So if you wanted to ask a question like, does eating chocolate matter for bone health? Maybe you can remember chocolate because it's so special, but you often can't remember other things or gauge the amount of it. And then it matters the life stage for a lot of these questions and relationships between diet and the outcome, and we're talking about bone today, or whether you're female or male, or your genetic background may determine whether you're going to respond or not. And if a study has merged all these together, then you might miss an effect that's important for one age or one group and not another. So let's start with the first main problem with the literature or design of studies that clouds our ability to know whether a supplement is effective or anything about the diet for that matter. Nutrients are considered threshold effects. And that means as you increase the intake, the effect in our case today is bone health advantage goes up, up, and up until a certain level. And then it plateaus. And that intake is the threshold, meaning if you're already at the maximum intake that would benefit your bones, taking more is not going to help you. You're just going to pee it out or something. So you have to start low in order to see a benefit. The control group must be deficient. If they're already up here, what are you going to achieve by taking more of that nutrient? So to kind of verify and show you with bone health, with the largest trial ever, was a calcium and vitamin D trial. What I'm talking about is the Women's Health Initiative studied almost 69,000 postmenopausal women and asked the question, what's the relationship between calcium and vitamin D and hip fracture? Well, here's the results with that horizontal line at 1, meaning you have to exceed that before there's a benefit. And with hip fracture, there was no relationship or most anything else. But what they learned was that people were already taking their own supplements and they had enough calcium and vitamin D on average to meet the recommendations already. So they were above the threshold and couldn't respond if they were already taking their own supplements. And then the compliance problem. Many of them weren't taking the pills. You have to take the pills to see an advantage. So later, Ross Prentice, who was the statistician on this big trial, went back and excluded the people who were taking their own supplements to start. So he only used the ones that had below recommended intakes at the start, and then he excluded everyone that wasn't at least 80% compliant with taking the pills. Now look at the advantage. Hip fracture was really decreased in calcium and vitamin D if they weren't already taking enough calcium and vitamin D at the beginning, and if they actually complied with the supplements. So then I worked with the National Osteoporosis Foundation, as it was called at the time, to do a meta-analysis and systematic review that included this new analysis of the Women's Health Initiative. And lo and behold, the data showed a 30% reduction in risk of hip fractures with calcium and vitamin D supplements. So that seemed pretty positive. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to tell you that supplements are useful when you're deficient in something from the diet. So start with considering your diet and how well does it meet the dietary guidelines. So my plate is the symbol for meeting the dietary guidelines, and you can go online and download how much of each of these food groups you should eat. And for bone health, dairy is the most common way to get enough calcium and bone-related nutrients, but all these other nutrients support health in general. And so what you're doing is evaluating how short are you against the dietary guidelines. And Americans on average are quite short. They don't consume the dietary guidelines as recommended. So this shows the percent of the people that don't even meet the estimated average requirement. Vitamin D, nearly everybody doesn't meet the estimated average requirement for diet. Vitamin E also, magnesium, calcium, a lot of these bone healthy nutrients are not being met because Americans aren't following the dietary guidelines. So the nutrients most often associated with bone health are calcium, vitamin D, magnesium, potassium, and high quality protein. So the nutrient recommendations for every life stage are out there to estimate what is going to be the optimal intake for bone health. And for some in pink, females are a little bit different than males. So for calcium at middle-aged menopause, they need 1,200 milligrams to meet their needs compared to 1,000 for males, and a little bit less magnesium than males, a little bit less potassium than males, but often in this age group, they're not getting enough from their diet to meet their recommendations. Now, to reinforce, you can get these nutrients in a variety of ways, from diet, like I mentioned, or you can get from supplements. But keep in mind, supplements are only going to have the nutrients in that supplement. So you might buy supplements for calcium and vitamin D, but what about magnesium and phosphorus and potassium and all these other nutrients needed for bone health? Now, if you go to fortified foods, they're more likely to have additional nutrients, potassium, for example, in orange juice or cereals, maybe some more magnesium, so it's a little bit better. But the reason all these expert panels recommend food first over supplements is because all of the nutrients, it comes with a big package of nutrients, plus we'll get into the food matrix benefits later. So the dietary guidelines recommends 3 cups of low-fat milk or the equivalent in cheese or yogurt a day. And that's because it provides all the necessary calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D, because we enrich milk in America. Half of the high quality protein that you need, a third of the riboflavin, a little over a quarter of the potassium, and a quarter of the magnesium, and many more nutrients. That's why the public says go first there. If you're lactose intolerant, there's many choices now, especially in our country, that have filtered out the lactose, and you can have the milk without the lactose if you want less sugar or you're intolerant of lactose. So back to this math equation of how many supplements you would need for calcium. For the recommendations, 3 cups a day. And for every missing serving of dairy that you don't consume, then you need 300 milligrams of calcium some other way, in a fortified food or in a supplement, for every serving you miss. So if you consume no dairy, you would need about almost 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day to meet it. So if you're going the route of supplementation to get in pill form to get your calcium, then you have some choices. Here's a bunch of different calcium salts, and it tells you how concentrated is the calcium. So the most concentrated and the cheapest is calcium carbonate. 40% of the whole mass of calcium is of calcium carbonate is as calcium. That means you don't need as many pills as the rest of them. So you get down to some of these other forms, you need to take a lot bigger portions of it to get the same amount of calcium. And it's 300 milligrams a day for every serving of dairy you miss. And if the whole thing, your whole calcium's coming from supplements at like 900 milligrams or 1,000 milligrams a day. Here's the bioavailability of calcium from some of those common supplements. So most of them are pretty good and pretty similar to milk, except for calcium oxalate's really terrible. And there's no supplement made with that because it's so terrible. Only 10% absorbed compared to 30 for a middle-aged person. If you have a kidney disease, sometimes physicians recommend calcium citrate as more tolerable, but otherwise it's up to you whether you pick a chewable or a pill to swallow or what form you want it in, because they're about the same. Here's the sad thing for life stage is when you're in a young adult, on average, you'll absorb about 30% of a calcium from a glass of milk or a cup of yogurt. And here's what happens as you get older, that your ability to absorb calcium really falls off. And that's one of the reasons that the recommended intakes for older Americans goes up compared to younger adults. So the Institute of Medicine set vitamin D, well, all the nutrient recommendations for vitamin D, we're switching gears to vitamin D. And here's what for the general population to maintain your vitamin D levels adequately for bone health. So over age 70, 800 international units per day. And I was part of the review team for those, but also on the Endocrine Society evaluation for vitamin D requirements. And these are higher. So above age 70, they're recommending, for the most part, 1,500 to 2,000. And a lot of people are saying, well, why is it so much more than the IOM recommended? It's because recommendations for clinical advice is to physicians who have or monitoring their patients. So here the physician can monitor your blood levels of calcium, making sure your parathyroid hormone doesn't get out of line, can even monitor urinary calcium, so they can safely, while they're monitoring you, increase the amount of vitamin D you can recommend and see how that relates to your bone health. Whereas the recommendations for the general population, nobody's seen that individual, and you have to be a little bit more cautious. But since those recommendations were set, now we have really confusing large trials that have come out, like this, the VITAL study, which was in over 25,000 Americans that took either a placebo or 2,000 internationals of vitamin D3 a day for, on average, for 5.3 years. And they were looking at fractures, total fracture, non-vertebral fracture, hip fractures, and there was absolutely no difference between those taking the vitamin D supplement and the placebo. So now large recommendations from societies are coming out and say, well, just continue what you've been doing as usual, but we don't have a reason to recommend necessarily vitamin D supplementation. And the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force does not recommend screening for vitamin D adequacy anymore because these large trials haven't found a benefit. Now, that's not to say vitamin D isn't important for bone health. It's just the average people being studied have enough. It doesn't take that much vitamin D to enhance calcium absorption. If you get too low, you have rickets in childhood, or you have abnormal bone health in elderly, but most Americans have at least that much. So it's not the panacea we thought it was for a while. Now we're going to switch to potassium. Here are the rich dietary sources of potassium. And a lot of people don't eat these foods in large enough quantities. It's potatoes and yogurt and juices and squash, bananas, spinach, tomato juice and whatnot. And if that isn't a regular daily part of your diet, then you need to be cognizant of how to get it some other way. And supplements are too hard for potassium. It takes hands full of pills to make your potassium requirements. So you really need to think about fresh fruits and vegetables and dairy in your diet. Here's a study that I was part of, conducted at UC San Francisco, that showed randomizing to increasing levels of potassium increase calcium retention, which leads to good bone health. And that was verified in this 2-year trial of potassium citrate versus a placebo, showing the normal decrease in hip bone that occurs with menopause and with aging was protected by the potassium supplementation. So potassium is really good for bone. And as an aside, it helps blunt the bad effect of salt on blood pressure. So getting enough potassium in your diet is really recommended. So now I'm going to switch from pure supplement discussion to say what we're starting to learn about foods that supplements have not been able to fill at all. And this is a really hot area of research. We're kind of at the beginning of understanding it. So I have 2 references here that I've written if you want to look up any science about it. But what the matrix means, it's not only the list of nutrients contained, like in dairy, you would have calcium, potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, etc. in milk, but it's how they're arranged and in what is the physical format. So what I mean by that, I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper. A long time ago, I did a study that showed the benefit of the matrix, only we weren't talking about a matrix then, so I didn't know to call it that. And this is an animal study that I did where all the animals got all the nutrients that were recommended to them, but the calcium for some of them came in as calcium carbonate, the supplement, and some of them came in as non-fat dry milk. The ones who consumed the non-fat dry milk had more dense bones, more calcium in the bones, higher breaking strength, better microarchitecture. So there was an advantage of milk over calcium carbonate during growth and maintenance. So milk wasn't just a source of calcium. It wasn't because they had enough calcium. It was something else about the matrix. So if you look at the structure of milk and dairy products, it's very complicated. So you have the sugars dissolved in the water. You have the proteins, whey proteins dissolved. You have casein micelles, these blue large dots that hold the calcium, and you have fat droplets in there. So all that makes up the physical structure of the matrix. And we're starting to think how it's all organized can matter to health. Here's an ultra micrograph of yogurt. So you see all the structures of the proteins around, and then you have the bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria that ferment the yogurt. So that's adding to the matrix. A big area of research in dairy are the proteins that surround the milk fat globule. They're the milk fat globule membrane, highly organized structure. And let me show you an example of how that can make a difference. So in this trial, people, overweight men and women, were given 40 grams of fat per day, so a hefty load of fat, either as butter or whipping cream. Now, whipping cream has a high amount of this milk fat globule membrane in it. And butter, it's been removed. It's butter oil that's been removed. And so when they looked at plasma lipids at the end of this 8-week study, they found that the butter with the low milk fat globule proteins behaved like you would expect. The more butter, the more lipids in your blood, the more LDL cholesterol in your blood, which is not a good sign for cardiovascular risk. But with the same amount of fat coming in as whipping cream with high levels of milk fat globule protein, now you have no change in lipids in the blood and no change in LDL cholesterol. So that matrix of how the fat was organized and structured mattered. We're trying to see if that's true for bone-related nutrients too. Here shows you how big of a difference the matrix of the food makes. This is calcium absorption from the same amount of calcium in a glass of milk versus as spinach. So I studied this years ago by putting a calcium tracer in a lactating cow, and we collected the milk, and I grew spinach and other plants hydroponically so we could get the calcium tracer up into the edible parts, and then fed it to people. And the calcium from the milk was 10 times better absorbed than calcium from spinach, which is high in oxalic acid that inhibits absorption. So that matrix of the spinach versus the milk really mattered. And I've been part of a study that has looked at what does that mean in terms of the United States Americans' diet. So over time, total intake looks like this. It's been going down in recent years, and the calcium absorption is going down even more than the total intake. That's because these calcium absorption inhibitors have been increasing. So phytic acid's been increasing over time in all these age groups. Oxalic acid, big inhibitor of calcium absorption, has been rising over time. And this is because we're recommending plant-forward diets. So we get more of these inhibitors from the vegetables we're eating. There's lots of reason to have plant-forward diets, but you got to be even more aware of your bone, because the trends are accompanied by reduced serum calcium and reduced bone mineral density of the hip. And that leads then to fracture risk. So here's the incidence of osteoporosis going up over those same time periods with all these increases in calcium absorption inhibitors. Now, some people are turning to plant-based beverages as an alternative to milk for a whole lot of different reasons. This shows you the general processing of taking nuts or seeds or grains and grinding them and treating them to get them in a soluble form, adding a whole bunch of stabilizers and sweeteners and flavorants to get these plant-based beverage milks. And I've been writing grants to try to study them, but it's not looking all that good for any of them except for soy. And why I say that is this animal study that looked at bone mineral density showed that here's milk compared to soy, which has a high quality protein, resulted in good bone mineral density for the animals, but almond milk way down here would not support growth in the male rats. And the microbiome was not as diverse from any of the alternatives compared to milk. Milk produced these high levels of healthy gut microbes. This shows just 2 of them. So for the gut microbiome and bone mineral density, the plant-based beverages look risky. I want to study it in humans. Now, to look at some bioactive ingredients as supplements or foods that can be used, there's some room for hope, especially if your intake of calcium is kind of low because of not choosing to consume enough dairy products. So here's probably the fiber additive that we've studied that does the most good for bones. This shows you 10 grams per day or 20 grams a day resulted in this much increased retention of calcium in bones. This was enough to stop postmenopausal women bone loss. It's that big of an effect. And we did 2 studies in adolescents and 1 in postmenopausal women, and that led to FDA guidance to say manufacturers could include soluble corn fiber because it meets the dietary fiber definition for some health benefit on the label claims, saying it's a dietary fiber beyond just gut health. So you can buy soluble corn fiber in many forms in any supplement retail operation, or you can get it online. It's cheap, inert. You can add it to anything, pour it into a drink. It's pretty easy. But another way to get bone benefits is from polyphenol-rich fruits. Now, polyphenols are the pigments that make blueberries blue, prunes blue, the rich dark colors. So for a long time, we've known from observational studies that diets high in fruits and vegetables have been associated with a benefit to bones, especially ones that have these pigments in them. And so I've been involved in a number of studies that the bottom line is 5 to 6 prunes a day or 3/4 a cup of blueberries a day is enough to stop the average postmenopausal woman's bone loss. Now, there may be extreme reasons, genetic risks or something where you need additional help besides diet. But this would be a good thing to incorporate in your diet, either prunes or blueberries or some mixture, or a combination with the soluble corn fiber. Those are the best things we know that diet can do, aside from calcium and vitamin D from dairy. It even helps, prunes even have been shown to help with glucocorticoid-induced osteoporosis. That's the leading cause of secondary osteoporosis, having glucocorticoids. It leads to a dysfunctional microbiome in your gut that leads to bone loss. And so Laura McCabe at Michigan State University has shown that if you add prune powder to the diet of the rats, you get healthy bones. And this shows you the huge increase in bone volume in these animals. So I too have a study that you could be part of if you like. So you have to be at least 1 year postmenopausal, have mild bone loss, not on hormone replacement therapy within the last 3 months. And this is a 2-year project, so it's a much more rigorous demand on your time than the exercise one you heard at the beginning. And so you would be randomized to prunes or control for 2 years, and you would have your bone mineral density tested then at the beginning, after 1 year and 2 years. And so the contact is my colleague, Dr. Shireen Hushman, and the email address for the study is nutrition.sdsu@gmail.com, or you can scan this QR code to email, or you can contact us. We can also get you in touch with Shireen. So here you would have your prunes provided for you that would hopefully have amazing bone benefits to you. So in conclusion, the source matters for these nutrients, but the total intake matters more. And I would summarize some of the key points as the food matrix is altered through processing and formulation. Dairy products are a rich source of bone building nutrients and has been the most studied food so far for matrix effects on health. Ultra processed alternatives to milk are understudied, so we're going in the dark about their advantages. Polyphenol fruits, including prunes and blueberries, are shown to have bone benefits in preclinical and clinical studies, and the role of the food matrix is an exciting area of research, so stay tuned. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Connie. That was great. I'll go through some of the questions that we have seen pop up in the chat as you've been talking. Lois wanted to know a little bit more about some of the concerns that have been raised about taking calcium supplements and the effects on your heart. Oh, Connie, you're muted somehow.
I don't know how I got muted, but thank you for the question on is there any risk for calcium supplements and cardiovascular risk. So there was a lot of attention some years ago about a New Zealand investigator who had done a trial on randomizing participants to calcium versus placebo and found bone benefits, which is why he designed the study in the first place. But he went back and looked, was there any cardiovascular risk, and found an increase of myocardial infarction in the calcium supplement arm of the study. There has been so much research since then, with everybody going back to their trials and looking to see if they found the same thing. They did not. There's been all kinds of other kinds of outcome measures on new trials that have looked at it with no concern. We did a pig study so we could look at actual calcification of arteries and whatnot by PET CT scanning and ultrasound, everything we could measure. We ran calcium up as high as the upper limit by supplements and by dairy, no additional risk. So no society has concluded to worry about calcium supplements and heart. And it is really worrisome that it might risk your bone health if you stopped getting calcium somehow, either through diet or supplements.
Yes, absolutely. We got a few questions about varying types of calcium, so I'm curious your thoughts on this. So Joanne and Roya asked about calcium sources from algae or mycocrystalline hydroxyapatite, which respectively are from vegan and bovine sources. And then Roya was asking your thoughts on elemental calcium, which I think she uses Bone Up, which has elemental calcium in there.
Well, so calcium comes in anything as a compound. And so the label might say elemental calcium, but that's just what is the fraction of calcium from whatever compound it is. You can't put pure calcium. It doesn't exist in there. It's just telling you the amount of the calcium without the carbonate or the gluconate or whatever the form is. So interesting, you asked about the microalgae, because I'm working with my food science colleague who studies microalgae here to try to get enough calcium in the microalgae he's creating in order to do a study, in an animal study, to look at the quality of bones and calcium absorption. So we don't know anything yet about how good it will be for bone, but I'm hoping to know before too long. Maybe the next time you invite me back, I'll have some data on that. We're working on that very thing right now. So some of the other sources that you might look at, be sure to look up if they're at risk for heavy metal, because some sources concentrate heavy metals that are kind of a toxic by a contaminant, I should say. And so beware of that.
Okay, great. We also had a patient ask, she's been taking Tums as her calcium. I'm not sure if she's also taking this perhaps for acid reflux, so we're kind of getting a double benefit there. She asked your thoughts on that, or if you would recommend something else for calcium supplementation.
Tums is calcium carbonate, so it's fine. You know, like I said, for every dairy cup of milk you don't consume a day out of the 3 recommended, or cup of yogurt, or 1.5 ounces of cheese, for every serving of dairy missing, you need 300 milligrams of elemental calcium somehow. And Tums would be an okay way to get it.
Perfect. And then we had a couple questions about some milk alternatives like kefir or goat milk specifically. Have you seen any difference in the nutritional benefit there?
Well, goat milk's a little higher in fat if you have whole, but in terms of the micronutrients for bone benefits, all those sources of milk should be fine.
And what about, we had another patient ask about lactate milk.
Yeah, if you get rid of the sugar by ultrafiltration or lactate removal, any of those ways doesn't influence your micronutrient benefits.
And then Barbara asked, doesn't soy have an inflammatory connection, and isn't it risky for women, particularly in light of breast cancer?
So you're worried about the isoflavones in soy. That was a lot of concern for a while, and I haven't heard anything about that much lately. Soy protein is a really good quality. I've done the calcium absorption studies in humans with soy beverage, and it was as good as milk. That's the only one that's been studied. But soy is very different in terms of the quality of nutrients it provides relative to the other plant alternative beverages. It's been the most tested. It's a benefit, and I don't see any societies raising those concerns that they used to wonder about with the isoflavones, which are a similar chemical structure to estrogens, is why they thought it might be a concern.
Okay, great. And then another question was, do acidic foods leach calcium from the bone, and are dairy products considered to be acidic?
So um, if you take any food and consume it, it first hits the stomach, which has a pH value less than 2, which is highly acidic. And so the pH of a food, it doesn't do anything to that strong pH of the stomach. And then it goes into your small intestine and hits a pH 8, which is all this highly controlled. So I want to worry. One thing that you might have heard is a acid ash diet is worse for bone health than an alkaline ash diet. Also, to translate that into practical terms, eat lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains to buffer any acid ash in your diet that comes from animal sources. But the pH of the food per se is not very influential.
Okay. And we had another patient who was familiar with your work in corn dextrin. And
Well, that's the soluble corn fiber that I
yeah,
mentioned. Yeah.
he asked, does wheat dextrin have similar benefits? She says it's cheaper and easier to find.
So I should have expanded on this discussion of the soluble corn fiber. It's not just an extracted carbohydrate from corn. It's been chemically modified by manufacturers, starting with Tate and Lyle. Did most of the proprietary work. And so it's chemically modified and it's concentrated relative to anything you could consume in foods. So you have to, it's not a natural type of product that you would get. So if you have concerns about that, think blueberries and prunes. But if you don't have concerns about that, it's a pretty cheap alternative. And until some other manufacturers works on wheat or some other grain carbohydrate to do the same things that Tate and Lyle did to soluble corn fiber and then test it, there's no reason to think that it would have the same benefits.
Okay, great. We had another person ask about many almond milks have a much higher concentration of calcium than cow's milk, and what are your thoughts on that?
So the nutrient composition of cow's milk is pretty constant. You know, Mother Nature sort of regulates it, but it's regulated under industry or under FDA as well. The plant-based beverages are all over the board. I've published a paper with colleagues that show the huge range and variation of all these micronutrients in the different beverages. It's not under any kind of quality control or standard of identity or anything. So it's a little bit potluck what you're getting, and they have not been studied for health effects yet, except for the little bit of preclinical evidence that I showed you, but not in humans, other than soy. That's the only one.
Okay. And we had another person ask, how can one eat so many prunes without creating the runs?
So this study that I was a co-investigator on that was done at Penn State for 1 year, it was a dose response study. And if they took the level that was 3 to 5 or even up to 6 prunes a day, we didn't hear many complaints. But the study, the highest level where it was up to 12 prunes a day, lots of complaints. And so there were a lot more dropouts and non-compliance with that. So 5 prunes a day, we found postmenopausal women tolerated that pretty well.
Great. And then a follow-up question to that was, again, how many prunes per day and what the other product was used in the study? You mentioned
So
and what that email was again.
it was different studies. So 5 to 6 prunes a day, or 3/4 a cup of blueberries a day, or some combination. You know, you could also add in soluble corn fiber and not take as many prunes or as many blueberries. So
Great.
how much soluble corn fiber a day? I just saw that in the chat. And so we did that dose response. 10 worked well, 20 grams a day worked even better. So I don't know, I'd probably end up practically around 12 grams a day,
Okay.
something around that, somewhere between 10 and 20.
And we got a couple other questions about 2 supplements that we get frequently asked about in clinic, and that's vitamin K, MK7, as well as creatine. What are your thoughts on those?
So I don't know of any evidence that creatine does anything for bone. I mean, and they take it for muscle, which helps bone. But so Gina, you were at that conference at the Dell with me, and there was a lot on creatine. They weren't convincing to me, were they? You that it's a supplement to recommend for bone health?
No. And I'm hearing lots of claims too. I think there's cause to be a little bit skeptic, especially, well, definitely for bone, but in the doses that I'm aware of, I'm saying not in the research, but in the practical setting of endurance athletes, they're taking large doses, and some concerns there.
Yeah. So the vitamin K question is premature to have a good answer, I would say. There are a lot of forms of vitamin K. There's they've been studied in different countries and different models, and there's not a consistent message, I would say, at this point. The same lab shows advantages of MK7, I think it is, and other investigators have challenged those results. They couldn't reproduce them, and so I'd say the jury's kind of still out.
Okay, great. We have one patient who also asked about collagen peptides. Any thoughts on those?
Well, collagen peptide isn't a good quality protein the way dairy proteins are. I know you have collagen fibrils that make up the matrix in which minerals are deposited to make bone, but I think you'd be better off with great quality protein than starting with a pretty poor quality protein in your diet.
Okay, great. And we have one person who said she adds calcium citrate to homemade soy yogurt, which is soy milk with no additives
Right.
and a starter culture. She asked if this would provide a similar matrix to the dairy matrix.
So for a plant-based alternative, that's probably as good as you can get. And the calcium absorption should be comparable to milk. Soy beverage is the only one that's been tested for calcium absorption, and that good quality protein helps the calcium stay suspended in utilizable for absorption. So that's a pretty good strategy.
Okay,
Okay,
great.
I see this one question is asking if calcium citrate's better absorbed than calcium carbonate. I did this exercise in class once where I set them up to have a debate, and one side the students were trying to find all the studies that said calcium carbonate was better than calcium citrate, and the other side was the opposite. And both sides found 6 studies and each, and the one that said calcium was the same from calcium citrate as calcium carbonate used the state-of-the-art techniques. The one that said, the side that said calcium citrate was better used poor quality methods. So right now I would conclude the best evidence is that they're the same.
Okay, great. We had a couple questions about articles that have discussed the amount of calcium to take and how much can be absorbed in a given sitting, and the suggestion that you should take that multiple times throughout the day, and they wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm one of the authors that put forward you'll utilize your calcium more efficiently if you take it throughout the day rather than all at once at one dose, because it's sort of a linear. And so Bob Haney and I sort of came out with an upper limit to take at one time is about 500 milligrams a day. But that amount was just sort of a practical determination. It wasn't a hard stop. It's sort of linear. The idea is you can't absorb as efficiently big doses, so spread it throughout the day.
Perfect. And then we had another question about the book, The China Study, that outlines the research regarding how dairy can increase inflammation in the body, which can result in bone loss. What are your thoughts on that?
I have not seen evidence that